Hello YouTube, Sidekick here with a quick look at Microsoft Flight Simulator World Update 11. And that World Update is for Canada. It includes several urban areas, several landmarks, new airports and activities. And to mark the event, I decided to take a classic flight between two of those cities that have been updated in an iconic Canadian aircraft. So today, we're flying from downtown Victoria to downtown Vancouver, and we're doing it in a twin Otter seaplane in Harbour Air livery. And we're just about to get off the ground here in Victoria. Now, Harbour Air, in case you didn't know, does operate a busy schedule connecting 10 different communities in the British Columbia Lower Mainland in Vancouver Island with daily flights and charter tours, flying classic de Havilland Canada Beavers, Otters, Twin Otters, and some Cessna Grand Caravan. And if you spend any time around Victoria, Vancouver, or other Lower Mainland BC communities, you can't have helped but notice the Harbour Air aircraft coming and going. So, since World Update 11 is all about Canada, this flight in this aircraft seemed like a great way to celebrate that update. Now, I haven't done a review of a World Update before, and that's mostly because I didn't really have anything to judge them by. But World Update 11 is very much in my backyard, literally. First of all, because those of you who know me and know my channel know that I am Canadian, and unabashedly so. I've also lived and spent a significant amount of time in many parts of the country, and many parts that were the subject of this update. And to be fair, in Microsoft Flight Simulator, one of the things I really enjoy doing is flying close to home. So we've reached a cruising altitude here. It's only about 2,000 feet, but at least for the sightseeing part of the trip, that's where we're going to be flying. We're flying over the Canadian Forces Base at Esquimalt right now, which is just outside of Victoria. We're going to turn around and go back over Victoria and take a look at the city, since it is one of the cities that received an update, and one of the major landmarks of this update is the legislative building, so we'll go take a look at that. So while we're taking our short flight across the Strait of Georgia today, which is the body of water that separates Vancouver Island from the Lower Mainland and Vancouver, I hope to first of all give you my impressions of the World Update, what is really pretty good, maybe even excellent about it, and what is maybe not so excellent, or maybe more to the point what's missing, and then frankly what is kind of mystifying about it. And after that, I think I'd like to stop and talk a little about Canada and flying in Canada, and why, now that you have this World Update that involves Canada, maybe you should spend some more time up here. I get the feeling from some other reviewers' comments on World Update 11 that they're kind of surprised by the inclusion of the Canadian update in Microsoft Flight Simulator. It's not that they think it wasn't a useful thing to do, they're just not sure why it was necessary. So, some of that is probably my inherent Canadian inferiority complex. No people on Earth are as easy to convince they're being ignored as Canadians are, after all. Which is not kind of surprising when you consider history and geography, but that's a topic for another day, or maybe many days. The flip side of this inferiority complex is that Canadians are also ridiculously pleased when someone does notice that we're here. And now we're flying over downtown Victoria and the harbour, which is really the centerpiece of Victoria, and I can tell you from having spent time there that this is a pretty good model. Not only the legislative building, which you see just going past the back of the cockpit at this point, but also the Empress Hotel there, which is really a centerpiece of the harbour area. And it looks to me like a very attractive place on this summer or early fall, late afternoon. And I think Microsoft has done a great job of modeling that particular area. So, as I was saying, my inherent Canadian inferiority complex did lead to little wriggles of joy and anticipation when I found out that Microsoft Flight Simulator was going to devote an entire World Update to Canada. So, first of all, do I like what they've done? Yes. Overall, I do. I mean, let's face it, it's free as part of owning the game, so the bar is not very high to get over in terms of whether it's worth it. But given the continuous upgrading of scenery is a feature that's very much sold with Microsoft Flight Simulator, I think it's fair to ask the question, was the time spent on updating the Canadian part of the world effort well spent? Well, on the whole, I think it was. I also think there's some things we can discuss. Anyways, first of all, at the heart of the update is, of course, the new urban areas that have been updated. But before we talk about those, maybe we're pretty much done over here on Vancouver Island, so let's just skip to the other side of the Georgia Strait. This is Delta, BC, so named because it is the delta of the Fraser River. So we're just going to take a little trip up the Fraser River before we swing around behind the city of Vancouver. We can do a little sightseeing tour of Vancouver before we land in Vancouver Harbor. As I was saying, the main heart of the World Update 11 is, of course, the update of some Canadian urban areas, which includes the city of Halifax in Nova Scotia, Sherbrooke, Montreal, and Laval in Quebec, Toronto and St. Catharines in Ontario, Regina and Saskatoon and Saskatchewan and Calgary in Alberta on the prairies, and then Abbotsford, Vancouver, and Victoria here in British Columbia. This is a pretty good sampling of areas across the country. It includes some that, are obvious: Toronto, Montreal, Vancouver, and I guess probably Halifax to make sure that the update ran from coast to coast. There are some interesting choices. Laval, which is really just kind of an extension of Montreal, and St. Catharines, which I assume is just really means Niagara Falls. Some choices clearly had to be made. What do you do on the prairies? Calgary, I guess, is an obvious choice because, at least in the modern day, it really is the biggest aviation hub on the prairies after that. And so we have both Saskatoon and Regina. Not sure exactly why both made the list. And by the way, recognize that I grew up and learned to fly in that corner of the world, so I have no problem seeing the prairies get some love. But those choices, along with Abbotsford and Sherbrooke, kind of had me scratching my head a little, especially when Ottawa and Quebec City were left off the list. Now, they got their own points of interest. In Ottawa's case, the Parliament buildings. In Quebec's case, the Chateau Frontenac, the bridges, and the bridge at Montmorency Falls, all of which are much appreciated, but still, not to do a complete update of the nation's capital and one of the oldest and most iconic cities in North America, well, it kind of mystifies me a little, especially since I just don't understand the choice of Abbotsford. Unless it's because of a connection to aviation with its air show every summer, and Sherbrooke? Well, that just confuses me. And now, as a maritimer at heart, I also mourn a little the fact that time could not be found to do at least one of the smaller cities in the Maritimes, like Charlottetown, Moncton, St. John, or Fredericton. And not large, but interesting destinations, with at least as much to recommend them, I think, as Saskatoon or Regina, for instance. Likewise, the omission of St. John's, Newfoundland is also kind of unfortunate. Again, the developer spent a fair bit of time on Newfoundland with several new landmarks, including Signal Hill and St. John's and the Cape Race Lighthouse, but still, the harbor at St. John's is a historic and classic piece of Canadian urban landscape. At any rate, the discussion about who made the list and who did not could fill many hours of fanboy and girl discussions. Suffice it to say that the choices that were made were a good cross-section of the country and also appear to be pretty well done, as you can see from having seen Victoria and now Vancouver. And we'll get a chance to look a little bit more at the heart of Vancouver as we continue this flight. If anybody is interested, by the way, in seeing flights over some of the other new Canadian cities, let me know. I'd be happy to do some videos on that. I'd also like to point out that there are free modules for places like Ottawa and St. John's that are worth taking a look at over on flightsim.to. So what about the other contents of the update? Well, as with the cities, the landmarks range from the iconic and, frankly, essential parts of their urban landscapes, like the Parliament buildings in Ottawa, the legislature in Victoria, several bridges, including those in Halifax, Quebec City, Montreal, and Montreal. Things like Rogers Place in the Olympic Stadium, Skylon Tower in Niagara Falls. Some, then, that are kind of interesting, but a bit out of the way, like historic Louisbourg, the Banff Springs Hotel, Chateau Lake Louise, Prince of Wales Tower, several lighthouses, and then some again that are just a little mystifying, if only because they will be almost impossible to see from the air, and they're also smack dab in the middle of the parts of the country that are not particularly well modeled in Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is a topic I'm going to return to in a minute. Now, as far as airports go, they are all interesting choices. They're all small, mostly out of the way, although they're all also arguably gateways to some interesting parts of the country. One does get a feeling, though, that to some extent they were chosen because they were relatively low effort to create, but also because they didn't compete with any commercial products that are either on the market or headed that way. As I said, some of the update is really well done. Some of it's quirky, but still welcome. But I do have a bone to pick in this, though. But before I get to that, maybe just let's take a look outside the cockpit here. We are flying down the northern side of Vancouver Harbor extension of the Burrard Inlet. You can see the center of Vancouver coming up on the left, the island or peninsula in the left-hand side of the cockpit window there is Stanley Park, which we'll be flying over fairly soon. So, as I said, I do have a bone to pick, and that is that there's still a lot of this country that is, let's face it, poorly modeled in Microsoft Flight Simulator, despite the great work that's been done in places like Vancouver. I can fly over urban areas that I know well, and I can see that the satellite imagery that's used to create them is at least 5 years old. In some cases, I'm pretty sure it's more than a decade old. I can tell because of construction projects like Lansdowne Park in Ottawa or Highway 407 north of Toronto that have been complete for a long time, but which are still construction sites on the map. Now, I do want to take a moment and point out that this truly is an iconic moment in this flight, as we have an Harbour Air Twin Otter flying over the Lionsgate Bridge, connecting Stanley Park to the north side of Vancouver to North Vancouver, and that truly is a piece of Canadian scenery. So, I guess my point is that even though some of the scenery truly is impressive, like that just was, there is a lot of the country that just isn't modeled very well at all. I mean, significant parts of the country seem to have only one season of satellite imagery. So, like, for instance, if you fly from Ottawa to Kingston, which, isn't that far out in the boonies, or over many parts of the prairies, you're going to find that you see a winter landscape. Literally, you can see snow on the ground, even in summer. So I guess my point is that Canada's a large country. Most of it's not urban. And that should be one of the things that's attractive about it as a destination in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I mean, the chance to do some real bush flying. I would have happily sacrificed some of the landmarks or one urban area for a general upgrade to the Canadian scenery and digital elevation models in general. All right, well, we have flown around the western side of Vancouver. Now we're flying up False Creek. There you see the Burrard Street Bridge, another one of the landmarks including in this update. And you can see Granville Island, which is another part of Vancouver that many people may know well if you've ever spent any time in Vancouver, which also seems to be very nicely modeled. So as I have been saying, I think Microsoft did a fantastic job with large parts of this update, and I think they really are appreciated and will be appreciated by anybody who wants to fly in Canada. But the plain fact of the matter is that when you fly in Canada, you're going to spend most of your time away from cities. And it seems like not updating 99.99% of the country that isn't urban was a bit of a massive missed opportunity here. But independent of that, regardless of what you think of the World Day update, as we're finally coming around to start our approach into Vancouver Harbor, let me tell you briefly why I think you should spend more time flying in Canada in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I mean, first of all, if you're looking for great scenery, then obviously this part of the world we're flying in now can't really be beat. And the scenery extends up and down the coast all the way around Vancouver Island, so there's plenty of it. Farther inland, the Rockies provide some breathtaking scenery, obviously. The prairies may not seem that interesting at first, but if you get down low, do some river bottom flying, you'll find the scenery to be pretty interesting. And if you don't believe me, take a look at my video here about learning to fly on the prairies. If you want to get a feeling for rugged terrain, then obviously there are more than enough options from the high Arctic around Iqaluit to the area north of Lake Superior from Kapuskasing to Timmins to Val-d'Or, Quebec. And speaking of the Great Lakes, how about starting a project to fly all the way around the Great Lakes from Thunder Bay up north all the way around the wild shores of North Superior to the urban and industrial centers in the south, including not only Toronto and St. Catharines in Canada, but also Detroit and Chicago in the U.S. as well. If you do want to do a little bit of commuter airline flying, grab a King Air and fly the Milk Run from Fredericton to Moncton or St. John to Charlottetown, and then over to Halifax. Now, those flights are short, and the airports aren't that busy, but you can practice everything from picking your way along in VFR to full IFR routes and ILS approaches. If you want a deeper reason to fly in Canada, consider this. This country has a long history of aviation. Canadians have been taken to the skies pretty much since it was an option. Much of the country was only ever accessible by foot, paddle, or aircraft. And aircraft Canada have been designed with that in mind, including the whole line of de Havilland Canada aircraft, which started with the Mosquito in the Second World War, and then moved on to the Beaver, the Otter, the Twin Otter, the Caribou, and the Buffalo, as well as the CL-212 and 412 water bombers. And more recently, of course, Canadians pioneered, effectively, the era of commuter aircraft, with the Dash 7 and then the Dash 8, and now, of course, the Q400, and obviously the whole CRJ family of regional jets. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that the most popular small turbine engine in the world is quite literally the ubiquitous Pratt & Whitney Canada PT6, which is, of course, made in Canada. All of which is probably of limited interest to most flyers in Microsoft Flight Simulator. But as you can tell, it's a topic of some interest to me. I'm glad that this World Update gave me a chance to pull back the cover on a small part of that passion. I sincerely hope that the World Update gets a few more players interested in flying in Canada and in flight in Canada in general. For now, though, we're completing our approach here into Vancouver Harbor, which truly is a lovely, lovely place to be on this fine afternoon here. So let's just get it on the water.
50, 40, 30, 20, 10.
And there we are. Harbour Air has made another trip from Victoria to Vancouver Harbor. Well, as I said, I'm really enjoying this World Update 11 for Microsoft Flight Simulator. I hope it means that some more people get a chance to see some of Canada by air, at least in simulation. For me now, it is a big country, and there is a lot of it that I haven't seen. So, once I get taxied up here, I'm going to be off to see more of it. But for now, this is going to be Sidekick, signing off.